We're back, and I feel like all the tailgate talks we filmed recently in this garage, we never mentioned why we're in the garage. Did you guys notice that?
Yeah, I think it was just kind of implied.
So obviously, yeah, it gets darker earlier now, and we got to work and do other things. So instead of being outside in the elements, we back into Jake's detached garage and good to go.
Let her fly.
Yep.
Works.
Speaking of letting her fly, today we're just going to talk about a few different things in one, all relating to blood trailing and tracking hit deer and how our arrow setups, our broadhead setups maybe factored in this year to different blood trails that we had, and just kind of our opinion and our insight on it. We've discussed recently that...
First, I just want to publicly express that was an epic transition.
Was it?
Let it fly to letting arrows fly.
Yeah, that's what made me think of it.
Yeah, you did it. That was a great job.
Thanks, Jake.
That was like almost Joe Rogan proportions.
Well, thank you. I was wondering why you were cutting me off, but I appreciate it. So now that I lost my train of thought, I think it's, obviously there's people and there's articles and there's books and whatever about blood trailing, but I think when you get into hunting, that's, for whatever reason, one of the last things you end up thinking about, because you got to buy the bow, you got to buy the camo, you got to buy the stand, you got to learn how to actually hunt the deer, and I feel like the actual recovery spot can maybe not get enough attention.
Kind of comes secondary because, especially getting into hunting, your main priority, your main focus is killing a deer or killing whatever you're after.
Well, so finding the deer that you can then go and kill.
Yeah. So I think a lot of people don't think about that at all until they shoot a deer and they're like, oh dang, what
do I do?
Yeah, now I gotta go find this thing. And kind of some people probably go into that completely unknowingly and maybe even screw it up.
So, well, we did for years. We would just assume you follow blood, and we lost several deer because we bumped them out of beds or started tracking too early. And this is when we were little kids, so it's an easy thing to screw up.
Well, that's our goal with this one too, and I know we've said in previous tailgate talks, we want listeners to be able to learn from us, but I think this is one that we're not afraid to admit. We've lost deer for that exact reason Jake talked about, just lack of knowledge, really. And I don't have any statistical data or any facts, but I would be willing to bet folks lose a lot more deer when they first start hunting versus towards the end of their career. And I think just the 3 bucks we shot this year is a good example of that. We all took the safe route, if you will, when it came to our recoveries this year. And you and I smoked our bucks.
Yeah.
Jake still was a fatal hit, but we all went the safe route. So I think a good place to start would obviously be impact. That's when your blood trail is going to start, and it's going to be different across the board for many different reasons. If you film, if you hunt with somebody, if you're alone, if there's low light, if it's broad daylight, if it's close, if it's far. So there's a lot that factors into it. That's why I said this one's kind of just going to be a random rant, if you will. But if you're hunting with somebody, I think that helps tremendously, because you're obviously focused on executing the shot. Whether that guy's filming or just sitting with you, you got another pair of eyes on the hit, right? So that can go a long way, and I think give you a lot more confidence on what you should do moving forward. If you're alone, and I don't know, I've been fortunate enough to be able to hunt with you guys basically my whole life, so I don't know that I've ever shot a deer by myself and been like, I don't know what to do. I don't know where I hit him. So I don't know that I'm the best person to be able to relay that information. And you shot deer completely alone, right?
Yeah.
Do you look back and you're like, ugh, I'm not really sure where I hit him?
Yeah, which that's where filming is a little advantageous.
For sure.
So if you're hunting by yourself, not only do you not have footage to look back on, but like you said, you're also focusing on taking a shot, and you take that shot, your adrenaline's up, things are typically crazy, and it's a little bit, the memory's blurry of what happened. So it's not as easy as being like, hey, where'd you think I hit? Here's where I thought I hit, right? So yeah.
That's just something I've always thought about. It's and obviously you get down, if you can find your arrow, it's literally a puzzle, and you can piece all those parts together, but knowing where you hit that deer, unless you see him fall, and we all learned that this year, even if you know where you hit him, there's no guarantees when it comes to that aspect of it. So if we can recommend anything, if you do hunt alone, you know, really try to focus on that. Try to watch where that deer goes, how it behaves. You know, we've always learned and observed if a deer tucks his tail, he's probably hurting a little bit when he runs off, right? We've seen the contrary be fatal as well. But those are things that as a new hunter, you know, we talked early on in this tailgate talk about that kind of can be an aspect of hunting that gets overlooked maybe for some because there's so much to worry about. If there's anything you can do during that phase of the hunt or the kill itself, it's being an observer and being completely engaged on what happened after you release that arrow.
Yeah.
That can be the difference of you finding him right there.
That's a good point too. Like, I think trying to see how the deer is behaving, and then just be still. Some people like to get up and dance around and hoot and holler, but I think just being quiet and listening for a few minutes even afterwards. That deer may have ran 100 yards just out of sight, and he may be still alive but standing there, and then you may hear him go down, you may not. But I'd say it's probably better to just play it on the safe side and just chill out.
Sure.
And listen.
That's a great point. I've watched videos and I've seen both. After the hit, there's guys turn in immediately to hang their bow up, and I'm like, what are you doing? And then there's guys that the cameraman's like saying something and you hear him go, listen. Mm-hmm. Like, that's what you should be doing. Like, I want to hear what's happening. I want all the clues that are going to help me recover this buck. That's a good point.
Well, that's because you're supposed, the idea behind trying to gather that information is you got to think of yourself as like almost like an investigator. You got to be able to piece all of those different aspects together, and that is yardage of the shot, angle of the shot, shot placement, what the deer was doing at the time of the shot. Was he ducking? Did he wheel around? Was he alert, not alert? Did he run away tail tucked or not? Did he mule kick? And then after that shot, like once the arrow's through that deer, the process isn't over for gathering information. Because if they do fall and you can hear something, that only enhances the odds that you're going to make an accurate call when you go in to track that deer.
Those things you just brought up are all super important for the hunter alone, but at the same time, in the event that you might have to contact somebody to help you track it, those are all things that they're going to ask you. And the more information that you can provide them with of the things you just mentioned is going to greatly increase your odds of hopefully finding the deer.
Yeah, absolutely. And ultimately help you make the decision of, do we go in now to go get him? Do we need to wait 2 hours, 3 hours, next morning, what have you?
Which I think, like a general rule, even on a good shot, what do they say, like an hour? Mm-hmm. For me personally, I always give it an hour. And I'd say that's a good place to start, even when you're like, I just drilled him. Unless you see it fall, I always just try to give it time.
Why? There's no rush. It's almost, I think it's gotten to the point for us, we end up waiting that long just because we love this, talking to your buddies about it, where the hit was, what you were feeling, where he came from. It ends up being an hour or two before we even go. But
filming slows us down too. Like, you're going to call your buddies. There's going to be more people who are going to come out. You're going to want to go back to your house, get more cameras. Hopefully you're going to find it, so you're going to want to film that. So like, that is naturally what slows us down. But if you don't do that, still just pause, take that time to like just make sure the deer's dead.
I almost wonder if that's like a blessing in disguise for some folks, because if you don't have that to do,
it's easy to be antsy.
Yeah, there are impatient. I'm impatient. There are impatient people out there, and it's easy to just be like, forget it, he's dead.
Yeah,
and that could ruin it. Like I don't know. Again, and we talked about this with the Whitetail Legacy guys. I don't have factual information on this or an exact number, but I really wonder what the percentage is of when people go in 5 minutes after the shot, 10 minutes after the shot, right after they hit him, whatever, and they kick him up, they jump him, they push him, what that recovery rate is. I think it just plummets. Absolutely plummets.
There's a significant decrease in your odds of
because I think people think, and I used to be that way, maybe it's just me being naive, well, what if he was going to die, what did me pushing him make me not be able to recover him? And that's not it. He still will or may die. It's just you're not going to find him. I think when people hear folks say, well, you push him, why did you go in and push him out of his bed? Like, you would have found him. It's like, in their head, it's like, well, he's still going to die. What's the big deal? And it's like, yeah, but he has time to clot up now. He could go on to a neighbor's. You might lose blood for a little. And sure, maybe he will still die, but you're not going to get your hands on him.
You may have tracked him on blood to that first bed, but then you bump him and he's clotted up and he's not bleeding anymore and he runs 500 more yards. And from that point on, you're tracking with no blood whatsoever. Imagine trying to find a single spot in just a giant woods 500 yards from where you're standing and hoping you find it.
Well, here's two other things that I would think of that would be important in this regard too, is that one, there is no reason to rush the track job itself. If you're on blood, that should be a slow, methodical process. Step by step, drop by drop, marking last blood as you go. And it's easy for us to do that because we are filming, so we take our time, and there's more of us, so we're conscious of where our footfalls are, that it's not on the trail, that we don't cross the paths, and that we do take our time. But the sooner you climb down out of that tree to start the track job, the more likely you are to rush through that process anyways, which brings me to the second point, and that is, let's say you have a marginally hit deer and it does bed down. The sooner you get on that track job, the more energy that deer is going to have to get up and go somewhere else further from that first bed. If you've got a liver hit deer and it's going to die in 6 hours and you bump him out of that first bed within the first 20 minutes, he can run forever. He's got 5.5 more hours left of energy that he can expend. If you go in and you bump him out of that first bed and it's at 5.5 hours after the shot and he's going to die 6 hours later, the odds that you recover him are a lot greater because he doesn't have as much energy to go far away from that first bed location.
That's a good point. The hunting public has had 2 videos now where they've hit deer and made the right decision, let them lay for what they felt was a suitable amount of time, went in there and found the deer alive, but didn't have the energy to get up and run away. So at that point, it was in nighttime, so they couldn't take another shot, so they just backed off. But to your point, like, it didn't have the energy to run away. If they would have went in there right after the shot and found him in that first bed like they did 6 hours later, he would have had the energy to bolt and they may have never found him.
Is that a legality thing that you can't take a shot after, if it's a wounded deer, you'd have to wait till morning? I didn't actually know that, but I was going to jump in and say the same thing. After your deer, I had somebody message me and say they had the same hit on a deer and they ended up waiting however many hours and walking up on it and could get another shot in. So that should be all you need to know to just leave them. Like you said, if it doesn't take a scientist to know. I mean, that makes perfect logical sense.
I'm sure that the follow-up shot in the dark on a wounded deer that law might be different state to state, but I know, especially like on public land, you're not even supposed to be in there when it's dark. So backing out and giving it as much time as you can is always the best route to go, at least initially.
Sure.
Your buck, I think, is a great example of this because it was at last light. We weren't sure about the hit, but let's say we had 10 minutes more of legal light, and it was bright enough that we could see that you probably double lunged that thing. We still would have taken just as long. We climbed down immediately after that, looked for first blood, went back to the car, and it was an hour and a half later before we were back at that spot. Just because of how long the process takes for us to get ready to go for filming and to get the crew there and all that stuff.
Sure. Well, and that's another good place to pick up is obviously after the shot, if you paid attention to all those context clues and you're still not entirely sure, that's where you're going to be looking at your arrow if you can find it and the blood trail. So like, let's say you weren't with me on that hunt. I was by myself. It was that dark. I had absolutely no clue. We probably still would have took up that track job an hour and a half later because we were seeing double, lung blood, right? Bubbles in the blood, very consistent, spraying both sides. That's not one where we were like, man, we need to let this sit for 6 hours. So that's where you're going to need to make an appropriate and ethical decision when you start. I think we always end up, if we have a cavity hit deer, we always go like 20 yards just to see what it's like. Because usually, sometimes...
Well, you're not going to booger it up 20 yards after impact.
Because you would have seen him fall.
Right. That's a great point. So, especially, I think a cavity hit deer or with a pass through, like sometimes, I don't know if it depends on the broadhead maybe, or I'm sure the angle of the shot. You don't even find blood for the first 20 yards sometimes. So we always go that far just to kind of get an idea of, hey, what are we dealing with and what decisions do we need to make moving forward? And that would be where yours, I think, is a great point. You didn't have the greatest blood. The hit ended up being, perfect, but from the angle and everything, you weren't sure. So backing out made the most sense.
Yeah.
I'm sure if you would have walked up there and he was just spraying all over the place, you guys probably just would have went after him, right?
Yep. Which, backtracking, you kind of already said it, but having an arrow to go off of is huge. And I don't know if we should go into like what you're looking for when you find that arrow, if you have it, but like this is where knowing what you're looking at kind of comes into play. If you have real dark red blood with, sometimes it even has like black spots in it, you're probably dealing with liver. If you have brighter blood with bubbles in it, more than likely you have lung. And you also have to be mindful that you may get lung and liver, or just one lung and maybe not liver. So there's different things, but like having that arrow is huge. So in your case, you didn't have that. So you were just going based on first blood.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and you have a mix of it. I ended up having like, I don't even know how this makes sense, but I double lunged him, but I had intestine, too. I guess the huge cut on that expandable broadhead, but yeah,
you could have cut like, because the stomach is obviously further back than that, but the esophagus goes all the way down through. So you could have nicked that esophagus as you're going through that thoracic cavity, double lung hit, cut the esophagus and get whatever it was that he had eaten immediately before the shot.
Could be. Could be. So, okay, let's get into that. And we're obviously not biologists. We're all college educated, but we're not in that field at all. But
I took anatomy.
There you go. we like to think we've tracked enough deer that we know. So Easton had talked about like a liver hit, what to look for there.
Well, let's first do this because it's going to give additional context. But you mentioned wait an hour. Like that's conventional wisdom. You shoot at any deer, doesn't matter what the hit is, you should wait between 30 minutes and an hour. That's a good rule of thumb. That's not, if anyone out there is not a deer hunter that's watching this, that's not because it takes that long for a deer to die. If you double lung that deer, it's within minutes. If you heart shot a deer, it's probably within seconds. If you liver hit a deer, now you're talking about a little bit further extension of that time frame. But some of those things, the reason why conventional wisdom is to wait 30, 45, 60 minutes is to force you to slow down.
And you're giving yourself a buffer. Just like you're erring on the side of caution, which you can never go wrong with.
The faster you walk up on that deer, if it's dead, it doesn't matter. It's not going to change if you find him 20 minutes earlier than you did find him. Take your time and that will help you in the long run.
He'll be just as dead.
So now we can go into that we know how long it takes for deer to die with specific types of hits. And there are obviously anomalies. The deer that I killed this year was an anomaly, I would say. But now we can talk about some of those other things.
And if you're watching this and you're a super experienced hunter, you may want to fast forward or click on one of our other videos or something, because this probably won't apply to you. But if you're new and you're like, man, what am I looking at here? Typically we see lighter blood, and when we mean lighter, would you say like a pinkish red type lung? We're talking about a lung hit deer. That's typically, if you're putting a good, ethical, clean shot and you hit where you're aiming, you should probably get a lung or both lungs, right? Behind the shoulder, center of the body, you're probably going to get, you'll have a lung shot deer to deal with, and that's going to be one of the quickest.
And I would say that blood is more of a scarlet color. If you think about the Ohio State Buckeye uniforms, that's the color red you're looking for, where a liver is more like an Alabama red.
Sure, I guess that's a good way to put it if you're a football fan. And bubbles in it, right? And that's probably pretty self-explanatory, but coming from its lungs, there's usually some sort of bubbles in it. I've seen, like mine, I noticed there was like huge, like big chunky bubbles, and others you just see like these little bubbles, but
it's almost like foamy sometimes.
Yeah, I've seen foam. Yours almost like threw me for a loop. I remember when you first showed it to me, I'm like, dude, that's like chunky. Yeah. And I've never seen that.
I think it was just like foam though.
Yeah, and whereas mine, there was no bubbles. And honestly, for a while, I was like, did I lung hit this deer at all? I thought maybe I hit that front side lung and then it went through the liver and it, took all that lung blood off the arrow. And I was like, what in the world? But looking back, it was a double lung. The liver was never touched. And so, yeah, kind of one of those anomalies, not as far as like where the hit actually was, but more so like what the blood looked like, just didn't look characteristic of what you would expect from a lung hit.
Well, and that's a good point. We should say this isn't to say every time you hit a deer like that, that's exactly what you're going to find. It may vary, it may be different. You may have a certain angle that throws it off just a little bit, but as a whole, right? A heart shot deer, you probably don't even need to talk about the blood because you're probably going to watch them fall more times than not, unless you're in like some really thick stuff.
Well, and depending on, like, you're not very likely to get an entry and no exit on a heart shot because there's not really anything that's going to impede that arrow as it passes through that animal. So not necessarily the color of the blood, but the amount of blood will be profuse.
And that's assisted by where that heart sits. Yep. It's naturally lower in the cavity as opposed to lungs, which kind of sit up and back. That heart's already down low, and naturally gravity is going to pull that blood out of those entry and exit holes.
If you like blood trailing deer, shoot them in the heart. Well, it'll be a short blood trail, but you'll have a lot to follow. So I think some of the weirdest hits, other than, when you hit a deer like in the leg or something horrific, is a gut shot deer.
Yeah.
So for anybody, that can be the stomach, the intestines, a lethal hit every time, but can be some of the most difficult track jobs. And everything we've talked about leading up to this, I think is probably the most important for a gut shot deer. Would you agree?
Yeah.
So it's going to take a little bit longer, usually, not always, usually. Our sister shot one in the guts a few years ago and ran like 40 yards. Yeah. But usually it's going to take a little bit longer, and I lost a deer. My first buck that I ever shot was on the ground about 40 yards. It was a gut shot. Didn't know what the heck we were doing. We're just learning all of this stuff. Wish I had information like this. And we just went right after him. There was, you usually find stomach matter.
Gritty,
like,
almost like sand.
On the arrow. It usually smells. There's usually not a ton of blood on the arrow. And looking back now, it wasn't a giant buck or anything, but it was my first buck. I don't know why we didn't just stick that arrow in the ground at impact and, went home. Instead, we were like, it's getting dark soon, let's go check it out. And we followed blood forever. Ended up coming back the next day. Never found the deer. Probably, I'm sure, pushed it a few times. That's one where usually, from my experience of seeing gut shot deer, they run off tail tucked, and they usually bed down relatively quick. They're hurting, right? Think about that.
That's
right in the stomach.
Yeah, my first deer I ever killed with a bow, prior to that, I had shot a deer and hit it in the shoulder, which is probably why on this one I steered clear of that shoulder by a couple feet too many. But yeah, sometimes they'll hunch up and kind of like, you can tell they're hurt, which sometimes it's not a pretty sight to see, but he ran off, and I think from where I shot him to where I ended up finding him was within 200 yards. I'd say probably in the range of 150 yards.
Yeah.
And fortunately on that one, we backed out, and I think we gave it 3 or 4 hours. And we went back in there, tracked him, basically no blood at all. Like, I was crawling on my hands and knees through a cut bean field. And we ended up finding him in a bed. He even had his legs tucked. Like, he definitely specifically bedded there. He didn't go off and crash and died. And he had bedded and then basically expired from internal damage. I'm sure he was bleeding internally. So.
Well, and they will, and it may take 3 hours or 4 hours or 6 hours for that. And like Easton said, that's not ideal, but that's bow hunting. It's probably going to happen to you at some point if you're a bow hunter. You're going to hit one there.
And don't take my 3 or 4 hours as like what to do. This was when I was even less experienced, and looking back now, I would never do that. Like, I would absolutely give that deer more time. Yeah, more time than 3 or 4.
Yeah.
Well, and I think something to point out here too is that a gut shot like we're talking about is specifically through the stomach or the intestines to where you can see that stomach matter. We're not talking about a shot that's just behind the liver, because there's areas above the stomach or below the stomach or between the stomach and the intestines that you could shoot through, and a deer can live for weeks with a shot like that.
That's a good point, because you said, like, when you gut shoot them, they die every time. And I think that was a good point. If you actually hit them in the guts, they should die. But there are instances where you could hit a spot that finds nothing.
Yep.
And the deer your dad hit last year was kind
True.
of one of those.
Yeah.
I don't even know necessarily what that ended up getting or not getting, but it was kind of one of those instances where, not to say he didn't die or he did, but we never found him.
Well, and you have to think too that it also depends on the type of broadhead that you're shooting. I think for a gut shot deer, a giant expandable broadhead is only going to help you because you're going to catch more of it. You're going to, as that arrow rotates through the animal, you're going to tear more of it apart and cause more damage. Whereas the small fixed blades that you and I shoot, me specifically, through a gut shot deer, like, you could be just high enough that you just clip the top of one intestine and it's not a lethal hit. That intestine will heal up and that deer could live for four more years.
Yeah.
So,
sure. That's a great point. And that's why all of this, we were kind of hesitant to even talk about this stuff because it is one of those things.
There's a lot of nuance to it.
Yeah, it's so finicky. But after we talked about gut shot deer, I don't know if that's where you guys want to wrap up with that one. I wanted to talk about like those anomaly hits, like those out of the box hits. You might hit him in the back leg and he runs 20 yards and dies because you hit an artery. That's a real possibility. We've seen it happen this year.
Yeah.
So.
Well, Dad shot one where he caught the artery that runs right underneath the spine, and that deer ran 60 yards and piled up.
Yep.
And then the deer that I killed, I hit the brachial artery that runs down the front of the front leg, and that buck ran for 1,200 yards. And we were on great blood the whole trail. It never really dried up. It wasn't like we had to crawl on our hands and knees to follow it, but it took that long for him to bleed out, basically. And he ran the whole time. So if you take anything away from that, it's exhaust all options when tracking deer, but that doesn't mean do it immediately. Yeah. Like there's so much that we just talked about, and it can be so diverse and random, but you really do have to take a step back, do the right thing or your due diligence, and analyze the whole situation, but at the same time, don't look at a hit and some of the stuff we've talked about and be like, oh, well, that's for sure what it is. Because in your case, based on the stuff we talked about, that would have been a deer that had some hair on the ground and was completely fine until we went and actually investigated and started piecing all of those chips, those puzzle pieces together. Well, like we said in that film, and we had recommendations from other people that we sent clips of that video too. They were like, don't even go look for that thing. It's a flesh wound. He'll be just fine. You just gave him a haircut. And that's not what happened. So you do have to do your due diligence, and that's why it's important not to just stop at point of impact. If you know the direction that deer ran, follow that. Because even with my buck this year, there was blood on impact. So that told us, like, okay, what we thought happened isn't actually what happened, and it's worth our time to investigate it a little bit more. But there are other times where you might have that shot, and it, like you mentioned before, it could be a double lung hit. If in your head you're not sure where that shot was at, you might think you were up high in no man's land. And if you don't see blood at impact, it's easy for you to maybe say, it's a no man's land hit deer, odds of me finding him are very good, I'm just not going to waste my time and worry about it. When in reality, you could go 20 yards and find a great blood trail and end up recovering a deer.
So do you think there's an arrow / broadhead, or broadhead / arrow, or broadhead arrow setup combo that can make one of those marginal hits more lethal than another? Or do you think it just freaking depends?
See, of the options you mentioned, no. I think broadhead arrow fletching wrap knock combo is actually the way to go. No,
arrow length, and I would say diameter of the arrow, and whether or not you have one of those ethics inserts that rotates the broadhead separate from the arrow.
What if a guy like picked him up and he's like, couldn't have done without this knock?
We would have never been able to get this deer. No, I mean,
because I mean, it's one of those things we talked about. Is this with scent products maybe earlier? A lot of, I feel like, broadhead companies are like, shoot this, more deer will die. And I don't think that's the case.
That's not, when you went to refer back to something, that's not where I was going. I was going to refer back to how we talked about, like, confidence. Feel good, look good, play good type of deal. I think if you're going in with a setup that you feel confident with,
this is right.
You'll make a good shot, or hopefully. And if you don't, then you trust in your equipment enough to hopefully follow through and find that deer. I've tried it all, I think, and what I've found myself shooting now is what I feel confident with, and that's a single bevel, fixed blade, broadhead, heavier arrow, and that's what I like.
Flew great. Confident in it. Killed a deer.
Yeah.
Jake's heavy arrow.
Heavy arrow.
Small fixed.
100 grain, 3-blade, 1.25" cut. Flies just like my field points at whatever distance I want to fly that thing at. I can shoot at 80 yards and it'll hit right beside my field points. But something that came to my mind is that if it were true that the innovations of broadhead manufacturers today really will make you better able to kill more deer effectively, then those technological advancements would have been made by Native Americans thousands of years ago. Instead, they were whittling away at rocks and shooting woolly mammoths with those things. And that to me is because as long as it's a sharp edge and you can hit your mark with it, it doesn't matter what it is.
That's what Grant
it comes back to the confidence thing that you talked about. Like, I mean, I'm sure the Native Americans had a specific way that they, whatever it is that they napped that flint to make the head the way they wanted or the shape they wanted, and they probably felt the same way we do. Confident in the way that it flew and their ability to kill an animal ethically with it.
Grant Woods put out a video, I don't know if you guys saw it the other day, talking about fixed versus expandable, and he basically said literally it doesn't matter as long as it's sharp. Like, you need a sharp broadhead, and you should be fine either way as long as you're hitting a deer where you're supposed to hit it. Like, you just got to have a sharp head, which leads me to maybe our closing point and where we want to end this video. I had thought about this 2 years ago and kind of changed the way I aim and shoot at deer, and you said something earlier that made me think of it. Growing up, I don't know if it was just through videos or how you're taught or what you maybe heard from somebody. I was always, tuck it right behind the shoulder. I don't. I freaking come off that shoulder a few inches. Yeah. Because I feel like I see so many times, and maybe now with some of the technological innovations, you don't need to worry about it so much, but I shoot an expandable. And I see guys hug that shoulder, and you can't always account for, human error, and then boom, they hit the shoulder. So you're going to kill him if you're a few inches off. So I hold back off the shoulder.
There's all that bone mass right there in the shoulder. Why would you want to aim so close and give yourself such a small margin for error?
Well, I think we had a span there for a couple years where you hit a couple shoulder hit deer, and I was thinking about it. I was like, it's probably because we're just putting that pin right behind the shoulder. And guess what? You move a little bit when you're out practicing in the yard. Oh, that's a good shot. I'm an inch away from the dot. Not bad. But that can be all the difference finding the deer.
The argument against that would be, how do you know that you're always going to move towards the shoulder rather than away from it within that margin of error? But at the same time, if you can pull that pin 3 inches away and then fly that arrow within the same margin of error, an inch and a half forward, an inch and a half back, you're still lethal, and now you've got a clear path for the arrow in front of your point of aim and behind your point of aim. So
I guess if anything, it was more of a question. Do you guys find yourself doing that, or are you burying it in there?
I think this all goes back to the setup you're shooting. There's guys whose arrows are so heavy. They're shooting 150 grain broadhead, 100 grain insert, really heavy shaft.
They're holding on the shoulder.
And they're holding on the shoulder, expecting that even if they hit it, you're good. Yeah, it'll absolutely penetrate, through the scapula or both scapula, whatever. And so those types of people don't have to adjust for that, which allows you to hold exactly where you want to without that concern of maybe wanting to pull away. But in maybe your instance, lighter arrow, large expandable broadhead, you're able to do that. So it kind of just goes back to what you want. Yeah.
It's a good point. If it's just when I'm shotgun hunting, I hold on the shoulder because I'm I want as much disruption there as possible. And I guess if you got a setup can and are confident in, why wouldn't you do the same thing with your stick and string? So
yeah,
you're kind of sacrificing speed with a heavier setup. You're maximizing speed with a lighter one. there's so many different factors that can play into it.
There is no one size fits all for any of this stuff in hunting. There's no bow that's perfect for everyone. There's no arrow broadhead combination that's right for everyone. I think one of the reasons why you can get away with a big fixed blade and a light arrow compared to me is because your draw length is longer. So you automatically, just because you have a couple inches longer draw length than I do, you're already putting more energy into that arrow. So it's flying faster downrange. It has more kinetic energy simply because of the draw length difference on your bow. So, like our dad, he's got a 32-inch draw. That guy doesn't need to shoot a 700 grain arrow. He's probably putting above IBO type speeds behind it because he's stretching that bow to its max.
Yeah,
that makes a big difference too.
Which, in that theory, like if you're shooting a heavy arrow, you can get away with a fixed blade, single bevel, whatever, to punch through that, or if in your case a light arrow and a big expandable, excuse me. But like someone who maybe doesn't shoot as much poundage, a kid or a woman or something, would probably want to go with a light arrow. But because you're going with a light arrow doesn't mean you'd go with a big mechanical expandable broadhead, because you're not getting that kinetic energy. So in that case, you may want to go with a small fixed blade.
Yeah.
Like there's 100 ways to look at it.
There's a lot to it.
Why it goes back to, and you've said this from the beginning, I think this is one of the things that you said in your bow setup video, and it is all about confidence. If you like the way the bow feels in your hand, if you are confident in your ability to put that arrow on the spot you're aiming at, and then its ability to cut through whatever you're aiming at, there's no reason why you should change what you're doing.
Which maybe confidence ends up being the theme of this tailgate talk, because same thing goes for blood trailing. If you're new to the sport, you're going to get more confidence in your ability to blood trail and successfully recover a deer the more times you do it. Hopefully, if you're watching this, it can maybe speed up that learning curve a bit. But
and some of that too is that experience helps. So the more blood trails you go on, the better you're going to be at it, because you're absorbing all of that information. But at the same time, the slower you go on your first several blood trails, the more information you'll gather from those, which speeds up that learning curve. So this goes back to the beginning of what we started talking about, which is take your time. There's no need to rush. You don't need to go find the deer 20 minutes after you shot him, even if it's a double lung hit and he's already dead. The deer's not going to leave you. Take your time, be methodical, be slow. Learn as you go, which we still do constantly. Like, we learned so much this year just from the 3 bucks that we shot.
Absolutely.
And we've been doing this our whole lives. So.
Absolutely. And if you have buddies that hunt as well, ask if you can join them. If they shoot a deer, say, hey, can I tag along for the blood trail? Did you get more under your belly? We're fortunate enough to have, each other, so when one of us shoots a deer, we all are on the blood trail. But if you don't have that, if you know somebody around, say, hey, would you mind if I can come along? And that's how you're going to learn the quickest.
And for us, it's not even necessarily like to learn anything. Yes, we learn stuff. Don't take it that way. Like, we still learn,
it's an added benefit.
Fun.
Yeah.
It's just flat out fun to have people who are like, hey, I shot a deer. Let's get on the trail.
How many times do we say this year, I just want to follow a blood trail?
Yeah.
It's like one of the best parts. It's so fun. It's like that pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, right? So.
Can be, and it's more likely to be a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow if you do go slow. And if you take your time and make sure you gather as much information as you can. I think that's a great way to wrap this one up.
That's what I was going to say. That pretty much covers it. Jake and I are wearing some cool new Whitetail Legacy podcast hats. We were on their podcast a couple weeks ago. We can put the link to the video above, or the podcast above. And Easton's rocking one of our own. So if you want to snag one of our hats, let us know. Shoot us a message and we'll get one over to you. But thank you guys for watching. See you next time. You know how I want to start these from now on?
Yeah.
Oh, what? Have you watched those videos, the Hodge twins? We got a damn good show for y'all.
I didn't know you were talking about it. Is most chasing taking place at night and at first light?
Don't even go. Yeah. Don't even hunt. Stay home.